Hello, everyone. Welcome to Gramercy Books Author Evening featuring Jody Rosen, longtime cyclist, journalist, and author of Two Wheels Good, The History and Mystery of the Bicycle. Jody will be in conversation with Pelotonia CEO Doug Ulman. I'm Linda Cass. We are live streaming this program through Zoom webinar, and it will be recorded. Thanks to all of you in our audience for being with us this evening. And many thanks to this evening's community partner, Pelotonia, a grassroots cycling movement here in Columbus that has engaged thousands and has raised more than $260 million for cancer research through its first 14 years. Let me preview the next hour or so for you. After introductions, Jody and Doug will talk for about 35 minutes. That will be followed by your questions submitted in the Q&A box, typically located on the bottom of your screen if you're using a desk or laptop. This is where Doug will be taking your questions for Jody during the latter portion of this program. You can write your questions into the box at any time, and you can like questions already posed. Another tool is the chat box. This allows you to chat among yourselves, but it will not be monitored by the panelists. If you click on the chat box icon now, it will open a column on the right side of your screen with links to upcoming Gramercy Books author programs where tickets are still available. Registration is on Eventbrite, and I'm going to briefly mention these now. On Monday, June 26th at 7 o'clock, held at Gramercy Books, we host Tao Te, featuring Banyan Moon, her sweeping, evocative debut novel following 3 generations of Vietnamese American women. Te will be in conversation with Ohio State University scholar and acclaimed novelist Lee Martin. Then on Monday, July 10th at 7 p.m., it's another Gramercy at Home program like tonight, featuring historical novelist Kristen Harmel. Her latest is The Paris Daughter, and Jennifer Rosner, author of Once We Were Home. We're doing a hybrid Gramercy Book Club program on Wednesday evening, July 19th, featuring Lucky Dogs with author Helen Schulman on Zoom, talking to book club participants in the store. And finally, join us off-site on Sunday afternoon, July 23rd at King Arts Complex as we host New York Times bestselling authors of The Personal Librarian, Marie Benedict and Victoria Christopher Murray, for their new novel, The First Ladies, a story about the extraordinary friendship between First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt and civil rights activist Mary McLeod Bethune that helped form the foundation for the modern civil rights movement. You can click on the link to any of these programs to learn more about them, as well as to register. And you can learn all about Gramercy Books author programs on our website, gramercybooksbexley.com, and through our weekly e-newsletters. Now, let's meet tonight's guests. First, the man who will be in conversation with Jody and tonight's moderator, Doug Ulman. Doug is the Chief Executive Officer of Pelotonia, a grassroots cycling movement established in 2008 with the objective to fund life-saving cancer research. A 3-time cancer survivor and globally recognized cancer advocate, Doug led Livestrong as President and Chief Executive Officer before joining Pelotonia, establishing that organization as the global leader in cancer survivorship. Among his numerous board positions, Doug is an active member of the Young Presidents Organization, known as YPO, and the Columbus Partnership. Doug, welcome back to Gramercy Books, and thank you so much for joining us tonight.
Thanks so much, Linda. It's an honor to be here.
And it's also my honor to have you here, but also to introduce our featured guest this evening, Jody Rosen. In Two Wheels Good, Jody combines history, reportage, travelogue, and memoir to reshape our understanding of this ubiquitous machine. The book was published a year ago. Today is the release of the paperback edition. Two Wheels Good was understandably named one of the best books of the year in 2022 by The New Yorker. A longtime journalist and critic, Jody is a contributing writer for the New York Times Magazine. His work has appeared in Slate, New York, The New Yorker, and many other publications. He lives in Brooklyn with his family. Jody, it's a thrill for Gramercy Books to host you this evening for our Central Ohio community.
Thanks so much. I'm so happy to be here and to join you virtually. Almost feel like I'm there in person. Almost.
Wonderful. Well, now a warm welcome to both you and to Doug, and get on with your conversation. I'll get out of the way.
Awesome. Thanks, Linda. And thanks to the entire team at Gramercy. Jody, thanks for being here. I cannot remember a book that had such range. I mean, you literally traveled the world, spanning 200 plus years of history and cultural relevancy. And I was thinking about this. You go from stained glass to Soul Cycle. You go from Columbus, Ohio to New York City to New Delhi to sort of everywhere in between. I'm just curious. I know you had a passion for cycling as a commuter and someone who grew up riding a bike, but why this book? Like, did you know the history? Did you have just genuine curiosity? Why did you take on this project?
Yeah, as you say, I've always been a cyclist, or at least not always, let's say, but maybe since the time I was 5 or 6, but I've been an avid, commuter cyclist and kind of little kid knocking around town. And these days, the bicycle, basically my entire adult life, the bicycle's been my means of transport. I have a driver's license and can rent a car and drive one, but have never owned a car. That's, I guess, I live in New York City, so it's easier to get around by bike than to, wallow for hours and hours in traffic jams in a car. So I was, I loved the bicycle. I loved the feeling that I had when I was on a bike. But I've always been interested in its history, and was kind of steeped in the literature of the bicycle. Had read a lot about it. Especially, that literature is especially focused on the kind of late 19th century, early 20th century period when the bicycle boom, the first great bicycle boom, erupted in the U.S. and in Western Europe. And so, and I found that whole period and all that stuff super interesting. But I felt like there was a kind of a little gap in the literature, a place for a different kind of book, because I wanted to look at a kind of wider global story of the bicycle. And an interesting fact about bicycles is that the majority of the world's bicycles and cyclists are in the global south, are in the developing nations of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And I felt like there was that part of the story was, at least in Anglophone literature, inadequately treated. So I felt like there were stories to tell there. And I just kind of wanted to, use this as an opportunity to do some traveling, do some journalism, maybe experiment a little bit with like nonfiction form, and try to write something, I guess, a little ambitious, a little crazy, and it took a while. I'll tell you, like, I didn't know what the hell I was up to. When I first started, I thought, okay, I can get this done in a couple of years, but turned out to be a more ambitious project maybe than I should have undertaken. So it took me, let's say, several more years than I had planned, but I got the thing done.
Well, for those who haven't read the book yet, you did literally travel the world, and you just said something that I want to just click back on, which is, you said it's easier to get around New York City on a bike. I'm not sure everybody would understand that who hasn't tried it as a commuter, but you also said you've never owned a car. And one of the things that I found fascinating and things that I didn't understand fully when I read the book was, you said, I think there are 2 billion bikes in the world and there are 1 billion cars. Or roughly in that
roughly, yeah.
So you're in the majority.
No, this is, I say in the book, we live on a bicycle planet, and it's sort of a weird phenomenon because the bicycle's kind of hidden in plain sight for something. 2 billion is a big number, right? So there's a lot of these things around, but you can live certain places, and maybe even in Columbus, and not really recognize that, especially, I guess I'd say especially in the United States, because we really live in a society dominated by car culture, and our infrastructure, our roads, our kind of way of life is structured around automobilism, but there are places in the world which really mega cities in the developing world in Asia that truly run on bicycles, whose economies and kind of daily way of life is predicated on bicycles. And of course, there are famously places in Western Europe, Northern Europe, Amsterdam, Copenhagen, these kinds of cities that are cycling cities. And we're recognizing now in an era where we're challenged by by climate change and all the problems that come from our dependence on fossil fuels and on the automobile, where more and more cities, institutions, individuals around the world are embracing the bicycle. So we're kind of in the midst. It's a good moment for books on bicycles, because we're in the midst of a new bicycle boom, and maybe even one that's kind of more urgent than in the past, because we're kind of returning to the bicycle at a moment of crisis. So yeah, but it is true. It's strange, because cars and, for that matter, airplanes and other forms of transport so dominate our daily lives and our kind of conception of the world that it's hard to adjust your thinking to imagine the bicycle, which we tend to think of as this kind of pokey little Victorian relic, is so important and is so crucial to modern life. But in fact, it is, and the bicycle has never gone away. So I try and point that out here and recover some of that history.
Well, you did such a good job of showing how, in some ways, the bike hasn't changed, and in other ways, it's changed dramatically. And you just mentioned a second ago, both aviation as well as automobiles. And in the book, you talk about how both of those, in some ways, come from the bike. You might maybe expand upon that, and sort of how the traditional modes of transportation that people sort of may think of as the dominant modes, or the ones that take us around the world, actually sort of have roots in the bicycle.
Yeah, no, the story of the kind of lineage of these forms of transportation are very, very interesting, very curious, weird actually. And the bicycle has a kind of a unique place in the history of transportation. So before I get to the plane and the automobile, I'll talk for a second about the train, because a kind of signal fact about the bicycle is that it was kind of an anachronism at birth. I think I say that in the book. It arrived illogically late, because the bicycle, the very first proto bicycle, was invented around about 1817. This is after the arrival of the steam locomotive. Okay, so we're already into the era of railroad travel when the bicycle first arrives. The technology that one needed to build a bicycle had been around since the late Middle Ages, but it took centuries for kind of the humanity to work through the various the experimentation and tinkering that it took to actually produce a bicycle, of this very weird form of personalized transport. So to expand on that kind of idea of the bicycle as an anachronism a little further, we get the kind of the ideal, if you will, form of the bicycle around about 1885. That's the invention of the so-called safety bicycle, the form that we recognize today, which is the bicycle with two wheels of roughly equal size and pneumatic rubber tires and a rear-driven chain and all this, and pedals, all that stuff comes at 1885. Well, that's the same year that Carl Benz produced his first Motorwagen, and we have also something like a motorcycle that year. So the automobile era is stirring at the exact moment that we get the perfection of the bicycle. And that's why there was kind of a very short-lived period at the end of the 19th century where we really had a culture that was dominated by the bicycle. But in that period, to now talk about planes and automobiles a little more, in that period, bicycles really were likened to flying machines. People really conceived of them metaphorically that way because of the incredible feeling of kind of freedom and exhilaration that humans experienced when they were riding a bicycle, which is really, it's important to think about the fact that prior to the invention of the bicycle, there was no personalized transport device. The way people got around, if you wanted to get around quickly, was by horse, right? So suddenly you have this machine which could zip you through the street or down the road. And for lots of people, they had this, they likened the experience to that of, being a bird with wings, or, to the experience of flight. And interestingly, there are, links between the development of aviation, of the development of the airplane and the bicycle. The most obvious one is the Wright brothers. Wilbur and Orville Wright were bicycle mechanics. That was their trade. And the kind of tools, materials, ideas they used to construct their Wright Flyer, their first airplane, those came straight out of their bicycle shop and out of their experience there as bicycle people, as bicycle mechanics. So they recognized that, like a bicycle, a plane could be an inherently unstable device, and that human being could kind of, the rider, driver, pilot could kind of balance his or her weight on the machine and in order to steer it. And, metaphorically, I talk in the very beginning of the book about all these images that proliferated around the time of the great bicycle boom in the late 19th century. There were famous advertising posters which kind of depicted bicycles as spaceships, zooming through outer space, through the stars, on the surface of the moon. And these images, of course, have stuck with us. You only need to think of E.T., the famous scene in E.T., where Elliot and E.T. go airborne in the BMX bike. So this connection between this both metaphorical and factual connection between bicycle and aviation existed since that period. And then just to move it forward to cars, and I'll be brief here, but many of the people who were the early kind of bicycle moguls, the manufacturers of bicycles in that mid to late 19th century period, transitioned very quickly into automobiles after in the early part of the 20th century. So people who were manufacturing bikes and were suddenly manufacturing cars, and many of the ideas and materials that were first used for bicycles, everything from ball bearings to the idea to assembly line construction, to ideas about planned obsolescence. This came straight out of the world of bicycle manufacturing. So a lot of bike people, somewhat self-righteously, like to conceive themselves as kind of superior in various ways, just morally superior, shall we say, to motorists. But one thing that I point out in the book is that, far from being adversaries, really, if you look at the history, we're kind of cousins, and the car and car culture wouldn't exist as we know it were it not for the bicycle.
Yeah, it's amazing. I mean, you talk also in the book about your own journey with the bike and sort of some of the jobs you had over the years and some of the ways that you've sort of engaged. And I've heard you in interviews say that the greatest joy you have is when you're riding your bike. And I found that interesting, given that you're not actually talking about going out for a 100-mile ride in sort of rural, parts of upstate New York. You're talking about just cruising around the city, from coffee shop to bookstore to, grocery store, et cetera. Can you talk a little bit about that? I mean, this idea that you're both powering the transportation and steering it and controlling it. And I'm not sure there's another example where that is the case in our daily lives.
Yeah. A bicycle is it's a really, it's an odd machine. And it kind of like, the mechanism, the secret of the mechanism is that the rider is also the engine. So you're kind of you're both the passenger on the bike, and you're a component of a bike of the bike. And lots of people, writers like the great Irish writer Flann O'Brien, who's a great poet of the bicycle. Others like Samuel Beckett have described this relationship metaphorically as a kind of merging. There's this idea that the cyclist is when on the bicycle is a kind of chimera, a sort of half man or woman, half human, half machine, right? And you kind of merge your body with the bike. And on the kind of best bike rides, there's this kind of feeling of elation you get, where you feel like you truly are one with the bicycle. And if you're riding well, you're in that groove where it's kind of hard to say where your body ends and the bicycle begins. So that what you say about my having written about like feeling great on a bicycle, it's just true. It's like when I'm in in a funk, in a bad mood, or more to the point, when I'm, I'm a journalist and I'm always on deadline, when I can't make the words fall out. A bike ride is a great way to kind of shake things loose, and it just feels good to be on a bike, moving swiftly through the open air. Even here in New York, where there's a lot of pollution and a lot of traffic, and you're kind of taking your life into your hands out there in the streets, it is, as you say, a different kind of cycling than, whatever, mashing up a hill out in the country, which that's great too. I've never been that kind of cyclist. My thing is, as you say, cruising around town, and maybe even my family, I think my wife just left the apartment, so she's not here to hear this, but so I can say it. But like, even doing some slightly daredevilish stuff out in the street, weaving through traffic, which maybe is ill-advised. It's a thrill to ride a bike, and it's also just an incredibly efficient, the most efficient way to get around, particularly in a dense urban environment with a lot of traffic. Like, you really get a feeling of a kind of na sort of feeling when everybody's sitting around, motorists are sitting around in traffic, and you're kind of cruising by them at speed on your way somewhere.
Awesome. That's awesome. We're going to get to the audience questions in a few minutes, but there's so many things about the book that really hit home. One of the lines that I jotted down was you say transportation issues are social justice issues. And I thought, given what you started earlier with in terms of sort of Southern Hemisphere, sort of underdeveloped world being sort of where the population of bikes resides, can you expand upon that sort of social justice narrative around transportation?
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things to say about that. I mean, one of the places I visited was in doing the reporting for this book was Dhaka, Bangladesh. This is one of the largest, most rapidly growing and densest cities on earth. It's a mega city, the capital of Bangladesh on the Indian subcontinent. It's a place with an incredibly dynamic culture, and also like tons and tons of really harrowing poverty. But it's the kind of city where, so in a kind of elegantly designed city on the model of Paris or Barcelona, like 30% of the city is covered by roads, which makes it navigable and a city that you can efficiently move through. Well, Dhaka, there's about 7% of the city that has roads. And when you think that there's a population there that's now something like 24 million and growing by maybe 500,000 or more every year, it's incredibly hard to move around. And the only way, and there's a growing car culture there. Well, the only way that city works is because of the presence of cycle rickshaws, these three-wheel devices, which are very elegant, elaborately decorated there. They're the kind of taxis of Dhaka. These are the types of machines that you find throughout South Asia, in various places in Latin America and Africa. But Dhaka is kind of like, the world capital of the cycle rickshaw. And so I went over there to do some reporting and to learn about the lives of the so-called rickshawwallas, the people who pilot these things. One of the it was a very, very eye-opening experience. And I kind of embedded with a man in his mid-50s, about the age that I am now, whose job it is to ride one of these things and makes very little money and lives in a incredibly densely populated slum area. So that was eye-opening for me, because I learned a lot about, again, how the economy, both in Dhaka and various other places throughout the developing world, really is, the bicycle cycles play such a crucial role in keeping those places moving, and how what we tend to conceive of the bicycle as, like, an accoutrement of lifestyle or of leisure. Well, over there, it really is labor. It's like, the way that many, many millions of people, like tens of millions of people, maybe even hundreds of millions, make their living using bicycles in various ways to sell goods, transport goods, and in the case of the rickshaws, people. But to get back to the kind of question of social justice, it was only the experience of going over there and kind of studying, reporting on this class of effectively delivery cyclists in Dhaka, that caused me to like kind of look again at my own city, where we have our own underclass of working cyclists, known here these days mostly as deliveristas. These are the people who deliver food mostly from restaurants, app-based delivery workers, Grubhub, Uber Eats, these cyclists, who are largely immigrants from Latin America and some from South Asia, including some Bangladeshis, really keep New York going. And in fact, at the height of the pandemic,
Sure.
arguably it was the deliveristas, and not only kept the city fed, they kept people like me, kind of nice yuppie quarantining in my apartment fed, at great risk to themselves, these delivery workers, but also kept the restaurant business afloat, kept New York's economy afloat. And they have been, treated very badly and subjected to all kinds of horrible labor practices. So there's a lot of social justice issues that kind of circulate around the bicycle. And of course, in that same period of the pandemic, we saw in that post George Floyd moment, with the explosion of the Black Lives Matter uprising, there were of course protesters, huge 20 million protesters in the streets of the United States, and many of them were on bicycles, and many of them were greeted by police officers, bicycle mounted police officers. So there's always, as I say in the book, a kind of contest, a struggle for the meaning of the bike around these questions of justice. And one thing that I try to maybe push back against a little bit in this book is there's, as I say, the literature around the bicycle people tend to be very romantic and sentimental about bicycles, and the way the bicycle's been framed historically is as a kind of liberating machine, and it definitely functioned that way for millions over the years. But there's also been soldiers who's ridden bikes in warfare, and there have been colonial officers, in the imperial adventures of European powers who used bicycles. And indeed, there were police officers at the moment of the Black Lives Matter uprising who used their bicycles as shields and battering rams against protesters. So I try and point out in the book that there's an ongoing social justice struggle that the bicycle is at the center of.
Yeah, I think that romanticizing of the freedom is something I found myself thinking about when reading the book, because I didn't understand all the things that you sort of share. And you even mentioned, related to social justice in the pandemic, you mentioned a certain Supreme Court justice who was sort of commenting that they didn't understand why bike shops were essential. And if you think about all the people who were delivering or who were sort of running around, riding around New York City or any other city, and keeping the economy moving and keeping people sort of healthy and fed, it was sort of a naive comment, or at least seemingly super naive.
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because the bicycle, like the bicycle is here in the U.S. is often thought of as kind of, green machine, and as a kind of, like a lifestyle, kind of, a status symbol of yuppies or hipsters or whatever. And it's sort of in our conception, we think of it as something that is for people who lean left. Of course, that's absurd. People from all walks of life, all political persuasions ride bicycles. There's many, countless bicycle subcultures. But it is true that they're from kind of people affiliated with the political right. The bicycle is a kind of a punching bag, has functioned as such. So in that instance, you had Justice Gorsuch, who was sort of making fun of the bicycle and lumping it in with acupuncture treatments. I think in his decision in a case that here in New York, he in his decision wrote slightingly of the bicycle, and likened it, as I say, to acupuncture treatments, or to wine shops. The idea that the bicycle is this yuppie thing for liberal elites. And even Fox News has taken a whack or two at the bicycle over the years. It's an easy target. But yeah, the fact is, all kinds of people ride bikes. Maybe even some Fox News viewers.
So interestingly, I'm going to switch gears a little bit, but Pelotonia has been around for 15 years, and thousands and tens of thousands of people have ridden in this event, most of whom have said they didn't ride or own a bike prior to signing up. And a lot of those people now ride frequently. One of the reasons that Pelotonia has been successful is that there's a long storied history of riding in Central Ohio. And in your book, you talk about a young man who was having coffee in 1973, I believe, in Mexico, in the midst of riding around the world and thinking about doing a double century in Columbus, Ohio, that turned into a long storied ride called Toss Serve. I'm curious sort of how those types of cycling adventures played into your sort of research and sort of what you found when people, because it's been happening for a long time, right? People go out and say, I'm going to ride across the country. I'm going to take a gap year. I'm going to quit my job. I'm going to, and you sort of highlight some of these adventures that seem sort of astounding to most of us who wouldn't think of riding around the world, but it's possible and it's been done.
Yeah, no, there was like in the kind of early period of the bike in the 19th century, they're beginning with even in the middle of the 19th century, like the 1870s, when you had what was then known as the high wheeler bike, the penny farthing, that crazy looking bike with the enormous front wheel and the small rear wheel. So at that point, there was an adventure cyclist named Thomas Stevens, a English guy who then moved to the United States and kind of lived here for years. Well, he did an around the world trip on one of those, where he rode across the United States, rode across Europe into the Middle East, to the Far East, and his story was kind of serialized in newspapers, and this became a big thing, a kind of form of literature, where there were many of these cyclists who undertook these long distance journeys, which were covered in the press or became fodder for their own memoirs. They're very interesting books because they reveal all kinds of interesting Victorian attitudes about everything, including the bicycle. And these were some of the first times that the bicycle reached parts of the world, the places that they'd never been before, because of these, intrepid individuals. So there's always this kind of impulse to, undertake long journeys to see how far you could, this weird new machine could be pushed. And of course, it's just a great way to get out in the world, to experience nature, to see the world. And so, for maybe even a century, this was mostly, something that individuals undertook on their own. But beginning maybe in the 60s and 70s, this began to become a kind of an industry of bicycle, both these bicycle rides, like the Toss Serve, like the Pelotonia, right? And also, of course, there were group trips that were sponsored by various organizations. It became a really fun thing to do with all kinds of interesting ideas and agendas behind them. So you were talking about a guy named Greg Seipel, who was from Columbus, who actually started the Toss Serve in the early mid 60s. That was his first, because he first started riding the double century with his dad.
Right.
And then a couple of years later, rounded up a few more friends to do it. And then the thing gradually grew. And then this same guy, Greg Seipel, undertook what he called the hemisphere ride or something along those lines. I'm forgetting. It's been a while since I wrote this book. But what he did was he and his girlfriend and another couple rode the length of the Americas, essentially from something like Vancouver all the way down to Tierra del Fuego, a ride that took them 2 years on and off. And it was on that ride, while he was in Mexico, that he conceived what came to be called the Bike Centennial, which was a cross-country ride, a big group ride, which went from coast to coast in the bicentennial year 1976, and was a very interesting event because you had thousands of young, sort of vaguely hippie, post-hippie type young people crossing the country, but really in what they conceived of as a kind of patriotic undertaking, a way to kind of like experience the real country, get out into small towns in the Midwest. And their route took them on back roads through small towns from Oregon to Virginia. That was the main route. And so yeah, it's been a big thing for well over a century, both as a way for individuals to kind of wow people with their stamina and their heroism, and to maybe prove to themselves that they can do it. But then also there are all kinds of interesting ideologies that attach to these rides.
Sure. So I'm going to ask one more question, then I know we've got a couple questions in the chat, but one of the most fascinating pieces of the book was the chapter that is all about the bicycle graveyard, and sort of your description of what happens when bikes die. And this is sort of from a global perspective, but I will just share with you that a friend of mine once told me, I have no idea if this is true, but a friend of mine once told me that in the United States, 70% of road bikes that are purchased are ridden less than 10 times. If you think about it, you get excited, you go buy a bike, you have a friend that takes you on your first ride. You then say, well, how am I going to ride by myself? Where do I go? And if you don't have that community, and Pelotonia is just one example, but there are rides every night of the week, and you can meet up with different people and you can sort of go. But if that is true, or if it's close to being true, you highlight things around the globe that were shocking. The number of bikes found in rivers, the number of bikes that could be recycled. I mean, it's in the millions and millions. And there was one story from the book that I thought was fascinating, was the man in Shanghai who was literally throwing bikes, I think they were bike share bikes, to the water. And the quote was, the chips in Mobikes are unsafe and disclose users' personal information such as their location. So there's the bicycle graveyard, and then there's this idea of the bike being freedom and yet being tracked by bike share companies, and sort of weaving those two things together.
Yeah, no, this was, I mean, I've not often been asked about this chapter, and I'm very happy you asked the question. It's one of my favorite chapters in the book. One of the things I had most fun writing, because there's this very weird, very strange practice of people dumping their bikes in the water all over the world. And I started to notice articles being written in the paper for places all over the world, especially with the proliferation of these bike share programs, where you have, bikes at docking stations, bikes that someone can, rent by the hour, and then, in theory, return to the thing. But it seemed that in cities all over the world, people were just having fun, vandalizing them and chucking them into the water in particular. So that chapter begins with the dredging of the Canal Saint-Martin in Paris, a big canal that runs across a swath of the right bank in Paris. And periodically, once every decade or so, they drain that canal in order to clear out all the stuff that's been chucked in there. And the last time they did that, well, they found just countless bicycles, in particular lots of the so-called Vélib bikes, these bikes that were from Paris's bike share program. So I started to research, think about what this meant, look at it as a global practice, and indeed it happens all over the world, and it's happened, I guess basically from the moment of the bicycle's invention. There's something very satisfying, I guess, about chucking a bike in the water. I mean, it's fun to see something go splash, right? And some people, I guess, maybe even for fun, ride it off the bridge and go in there and then let it drown. Why not? But yeah, as you say, I began to think about why it was, in particular, what other kind of, social moods were being, social movements, ideas were being expressed through this practice, particularly around the, with the proliferation of these share bikes and the vast numbers of them that were turning up in canals, rivers, in the ocean. You point at that guy in Shanghai who kind of homed in on the idea that these share bikes are compromising people's personal information. Yeah. And there is a great irony there, because historically, the bicycle, at the height of the bicycle boom in the 1890s, suddenly you have this device which gave millions of people a kind of, as you say, personal freedom, personal mobility they never experienced before. People across the social class spectrum, across the gender spectrum. Famously, bicycles were tools of emancipation for women, were embraced by suffragists in the U.S. and in by kind of feminists in the U.S. and in England in particular, and used as kind of tools in their protest movements. And yeah, the bicycle, was this, it goes right back to what we were talking about the bicycle as a flying machine. People felt that they were, kind of their own personal power was sort of supersized on the bike, and they had a freedom of movement that they'd never previously had. And in fact, could flee maybe the surveillance that they're subjected to in society or in their own families, and achieve, kind of self-actualize. Well, suddenly now we have in our digital age, a bicycle which literally spies on its rider, like quite literally spies on its rider, that tracks its movements and relays your whereabouts to headquarters, as it were, every several seconds. And so I thought it was very interesting that this man, just a regular citizen who was chucking bike after bike off a bridge in Shanghai into the river, kind of identified this as the reason for his protest. And I think there is something to this, because ideally a bicycle should be we like to think that it's a tool that not only gives individuals greater personal freedom, but also makes society more equitable, safer, greener, cleaner, nicer. But in fact, a lot of these bike share programs are run by big banks. so there's, I think some of the maybe hostility that people feel towards our corporate overlords is expressed in these acts of vandalism when you see a bicycle with the name of a bank right on the across the
I mean, it's just fascinating to think of them dredging and finding as many bikes as cell phones, or as many bikes as wine bottles, or as, just things that are, you would imagine being there. So, all right, let's jump into the Q&A, because we've got lots of good questions. But the first one comes from my friend David Cohn, who, funny enough, started riding when Pelotonia started and has now become an avid and talented cyclist. He writes, given the expectation of population growth in central Ohio over the next decade, how does a city like Columbus ensure that the infrastructure to support cycling for work and pleasure is available? And how have cities like Copenhagen and Amsterdam, can they give us clues into strategy for success?
Yeah, great question. And the answer is yes, they can give you clues. I mean, Amsterdam is really is a great case study, because people, I think a lot of Americans think, oh, of course people can ride their bicycles in Amsterdam. It's safe there. They have all these great bike paths. And there's this sort of, I think, idea that this always existed. In fact, it very much was the opposite. Amsterdam was a totally car-clogged city up into the 1970s. And it was activism, of regular citizens that created that place over against the will of the political class, and it really came out of a crisis where children who were playing in the street were being struck by cars, and there was kids were getting killed and injured at alarming rates, and so parents took to the streets and protested this and said this has to stop, and in fact we need to clear cars out of the center of the city and create more of a cycling city. And there was some precedent for this there. Of course, there had been a lot of bicycles in Amsterdam in the mid-century. Car culture really came there after the war, so there was this idea that we remember it used to be a lot easier to get around town by bike, and it was a lot safer in those days before there were so many cars. And also there was famously a kind of anarchist movements in Amsterdam in a prior period in the 60s where the very first bicycle share program was kind of conceived and proposed there. This was the so-called White Bicycle Plan, which was conceived by an anarchist group. And what they did was just painted some bicycles white and left them on the street. And what they proposed was that the city do this for everyone, and that all the bicycles that were painted white just be available to anyone. You ride it to where you want to go, and then leave it for the next person. But in any case, it was a great kind of political struggle, which resulted in this vast network of bicycle paths that protected bicycle lanes that they have in Amsterdam, and even more, I think, by volume in Copenhagen. And I think the lesson for us there is that it's up to us. It's up to us, and it's up to us to really to regular citizens to pressure our leaders, and and hope that there's to help create the political will among policymakers, because it really is possible. I'll just point to one more example, which is that when you have, the pandemic was a great moment in a way. It was kind of a silver lining of everyone suddenly, being off the road and stuck at home, was we had clearer skies, clearer roads. People saw, wow, pretty nice when there's not cars roaring around everywhere. The air is a lot cleaner. Lots of people took to bicycling during that period when we were sort of getting out of lockdown, because people were worried about being jammed into public transportation with their neighbors, and it seemed safer to be on bicycles. And so there was, and cities all over the world threw up sort of makeshift bike lanes. And in certain cities, there were visionary leaders who said, okay, we're going to really seize the moment, and in a very forceful way, try and create a new bike culture here, and by force. So in the case of Paris, the mayor there, Anne Hidalgo, a controversial figure but very much a bicycle person, has really transformed Paris. And she's implemented changes there such that central Paris is becoming, there are cars that are now banned from certain areas in the central arrondissement of Paris. There's plans to create more bike lanes and ban cars from more areas. And very last thing I'll say about this, what she did there, and what everybody in all the places in the world where all the cities in the world where they've managed to create great bicycle infrastructure and kind of beat back car culture, the big key is making it inconvenient to drive a car. Not necessarily banning cars outright, but getting rid of free curbside parking, making it difficult to park. You get rid of parking, people will suddenly find that in order to get into that, there's other ways to get there and do their thing. So that's my little diatribe.
No, so I love that. So the grassroots advocacy, as well as inspired leaders who can sort of come together. I mean, I remember years ago sitting in City Hall in New York City with my dear friend Howard Wolfson, and he was telling me that they were going to shut down Broadway and make it for bikes. And at the time they were talking about it as a public health, sort of how do you get people moving? How do you get people exercising? And how do you sort of encourage that? So yeah, the opportunity, I think, for Columbus, a city that's going to double in size in the next probably 20 years. It's not only a necessity, it's just part of what has to happen. So the next question comes from Mary. She says, you travel through life predominantly on a bicycle. It's part of how you function in life. What ride, location, or duration would you love to take for pleasure?
I mean, this is a boring response, but I mean, the rides that I take every day are the rides I take for pleasure. I mean, for me, like the utilitarian aspects of bike riding are inseparable from the pleasure. So I've been on and off my bike all day today. I got up I rode to the cafe this morning, hunched over my laptop, did some work. My son, my 18-year-old son, he's a big New York City cyclist. He's back from college. Actually, he had his bike at the cafe. I borrowed his bike to zip home and get something. So what I'd say is, my everyday cycling is for me pleasurable riding, and I love I love the way, the kind of interactions I have with the urban landscape on a bicycle. To me, it's the best way to kind of see and experience the city, because you're moving at an ideal pace, neither too fast nor too slow. You're moving fast enough to get where you're going, swifter than on foot, and to feel that great feeling of the breeze moving, through your hair, et cetera, what's left of your hair, and just to have that great sensual, groovy feeling that you get on a bike. But you're moving slow enough to kind of savor the details of the cityscape and really take things in. And if you're in a car, you're either moving way too slow, stuck in traffic, or moving way too fast to really, interact with your environment. And so yeah, that's my boring answer. I mean, that said, I'd love to. There's many more places in the world I want to explore. Many more cities, particularly in Asia, that I want to visit, and I want to do that on a bike. That's for me, my big tip for all world travelers is, any place you go, get on a bike. You'll experience the city and learn more about the city quicker, and kind of it'll have a richer experience of the city than you would if you were walking around, or taking the subway or taking a cab.
Yeah, absolutely. So question from Linda, with so much that you covered in this book, how did you organize it initially, and did that plan change as you traveled the world? Because it's not necessarily just chronologic and sort of here's the history of the bike. I'm curious how you structured it.
Yeah, unfortunately, some things hit the cutting room floor, including one chapter that I really would have liked to have written and finished, but it's which is kind of a weird story about the desert Southwest and California, and these weirdos. And I say that with love. These strange twin brothers who invented a bicycle. So that's one for the apocrypha. But I guess I kind of just followed my instincts. I knew I wanted to have chapters that were straight reportage, kind of like journalism. So some like the chapters that more travel log kind of stuff, stuff like the chapter that I talked about in where I traveled to Bangladesh, another one where I traveled to the Himalayan nation of Bhutan, where they have an interesting bike cycling culture. There were some chapters that I thought, okay, I'm going to do more straight kind of hard news type journalism. Others that were more essayistic, my musings, my deep thoughts about the meaning of the bicycle. Others that were kind of more straight history. So I wanted to have a kind of rich blend of, genres, if you will, in the book. And then I was very reluctant actually to write about myself. It's not my most comfortable thing, but I wound up including a memoir chapter, mostly because it was a way I could shoehorn in ideas about the bicycle that I didn't manage to get in other chapters. So using the kind of sneaky device of talking about my life was really a way to talk about like New York City, and to talk about growing old and being elder, old people riding bike, talking about being very young and riding a bike, and the kind of that primordial first bike ride that one takes when you first learn to ride a bike on your own. So yeah, there were all kinds of little strategies and tricks I used to try and work my way through the book. And I don't know, some chapters are better than others. That's what I'll say. I won't tell you which ones are better, but yeah.
Let me ask you this. What was the biggest surprise? What's the biggest learning or thing that surprised you as you travel the world for this book?
I think, I had some really clear cut ideas about what the bicycle meant. But I think, one of the things that surprised me most was this connection between automobiles and bikes historically, that I was outlining before. In particular, a thing called the Good Roads movement, which was a late 19th century movement spearheaded by, political movement spearheaded by bicycle activists at the time, to improve the quality of the roadways in the United States. because if you think during that period when it was mostly, horse-drawn carriages were the main means of transport and railroads, of course, the roads, the quality of the roads themselves were, abysmal. Less so in cities, definitely in the rural hinterlands, but kind of everywhere the roads were in terrible shape. So the fact that the improvement to the roads was really it was cycling activists that led this movement, and led directly to things like eventually the interstate highway system, the real paving of the land, so that of course these pneumatic rubber tires of the bicycles could ride smoothly over the roads. That connection between the bicycle and what we think of as the horrors of car culture, the fact that we have this beautiful land that's all where there's so much suburban sprawl, and we paved so much of our land, and gotten rid of so many old growth forests, and all the stuff that we associate, the environmental degradation that we associate with cars was really can be traced back to bicycle activists. That was surprising to me, and it was an education. There's a lot of moments through the during this research that really challenged my own sense of smug superiority as a cyclist, and got me to think that I myself, despite the fact that I tootle around town on my little bicycle, I'm as responsible for some of the problems we're struggling with as anyone who's a car person.
Yeah. So in closing, before I turn it back to Linda, I just want to ask you this, because at the end of the bicycle graveyard chapter, you sort of talk about this idyllic image of what could be if these bikes were recycled, not just for more bikes, but in sort of a way. And you have this great passage about sort of riding along. Can you share a little bit about sort of that idealistic thought that cyclists could be riding on recycled, riding past buildings, riding, this whole sort of, it really hit me as like a picture of what is possible in the world. And as someone who loves to think about what's possible, like it was a powerful sort of image.
You know what I think I'm going to do? I generally don't do readings. Like when I do readings, I like to bring along my laptop and show a lot of images, because I find readings kind of boring. And but I think the best thing for me to do is to actually read that one paragraph rather than try and paraphrase it. So what I'm talking about at that moment is about the fact that bicycles is about recycling of bicycles, and the fact that when bicycles, a dead bicycle may be wind up in a scrapyard, like the one that's not too far from where I'm sitting right here in Brooklyn. There's a big scrapyard, and what I notice when I've gone over there sometimes is that you can see bits of old bicycles which are being recycled and reconstituted in various ways. So that's what I'm talking about, and maybe we'll just listen to that paragraph. Some derelict bikes get a second life. The scrapyard down the street from my home ships its metal bales off to recycling facilities. There, the scrap is cleaned and sorted, placed in furnaces and heated to a molten state, and submitted to purification processes. Eventually, the metals, this is the metals in the bicycles, are cast or rolled into sheets and put back into circulation. Steel and aluminum are among the most widely recycled materials on Earth. Sometimes, as in Amsterdam, a scrapped bicycle frame may be reborn as a beverage can or as food packaging of another sort. Recycled steel and aluminum are also used in the building of airplanes and automobiles, and indeed bicycles. They are used in the construction of street furniture and housing and apartment buildings. The mystic in me likes to imagine a cityscape formed from old bicycles. Cyclists riding bikes reincarnated from earlier bikes, pedaling past skyscrapers supported by girders and beams and rebar made of recycled bike frames, while jet planes patched together from scrap bicycles soar overhead. Metal recycling produces environmentally damaging waste, but some byproducts can be recycled and put to use. The dross or slag that results from aluminum casting is sometimes utilized as filler in asphalt and concrete mixtures. In certain places, therefore, The road itself is a sort of bicycle graveyard, and cyclists out for Sunday rides are rolling their wheels across a landscape of reconstituted bones. So there you have it. That's just kind of my mystical image of the entire city, the entire world being built out of recycled bikes.
That's awesome. Thank you for reading it. Thanks for ending on that sort of positive, optimistic, idealistic thought. And congratulations on the release of the paperback. You've written a phenomenal book, and we are so grateful that you took the time to spend it with our community. And I'll turn it back to Linda by just saying to Linda, thank you to you and the Gramercy family for putting this together, and most especially thanks for your heroic leadership in all things Pelotonia. You are one of our most avid riders, top fundraisers, and huge advocates, and for that we are grateful. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks, Doug. Hey, this was an extraordinary conversation, I have to say. And Doug, you were an amazing interlocutor, conversant, whatever you want to call this. And Jody, this book, I have to say, I've told people before, I've never read a book on a single subject with such breadth and depth. It was totally an experience just in reading it. It was wonderful. So both of you, thank you so much. I just want to jump in and say thank you so much to Gramercy, to everybody out in Bexley, to Doug for being such a great conversationalist, and for for asking such great questions, and thank you, Linda, for inviting me along. I had a great time. Thanks, Jody, and hopefully you bump into my daughter and son-in-law in Brooklyn.
Yeah, they're right down the street.
Yeah, and thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. We've added a link in the chat box where if any of you in the audience have not purchased Two Wheels Good, please, you might be very interested to do so. You have that link now to do it now. And there are also links with registrations to Gramercy's upcoming author programs. Just come visit us, and thank you for spending your evening with us. And we hope you'll join us again soon. Thank you again, Doug and Jody. Bye.